The night someone calls you at 3 in the morning is usually the night your life refuses to stay the same. My phone vibrated across the nightstand so violently that it pulled me awake before the ringtone even reached its second note. I blinked at the glowing screen, still trying to remember what day it was, and immediately felt a knot form in my stomach when I saw the caller's name. Luke Bennett never called in the middle of the night. Not once in the 8 years I had known him. We texted almost every day, met for coffee nearly every weekend, and somehow always found time to complain about work together, but a phone call at 3:12 in the morning was something entirely different. I answered before the second ring could end. "Luke." The line remained silent for a moment except for the faint sound of wind. Then I heard his voice, softer than I had ever heard it before. "Caleb." He paused again, as though choosing every word with impossible care. "Come outside." I sat upright immediately. "What happened?" Another long silence followed. "Please, just come outside before I lose the courage." The call ended. I stared at the dark screen for several seconds, hoping it would light up again with an explanation that never came. My heart was already racing as I pulled on a sweatshirt, jeans, and sneakers before hurrying through the apartment. The hallway felt strangely quiet. Outside, the late summer air carried a cool breeze through the empty neighborhood. Streetlights reflected across parked cars, while the entire block seemed frozen beneath the deep blue darkness that only existed a few hours before sunrise. Then I saw him. Luke's old dark gray pickup truck sat beneath the maple tree across from my building with its engine quietly idling. He leaned against the driver's door wearing his faded olive field jacket over a navy shirt, both hands wrapped around 2 paper coffee cups. The porch light caught the familiar outline of his face, but something about his expression immediately told me this was not an ordinary visit. He looked exhausted, thoughtful, and strangely determined all at once. As soon as he noticed me, he offered one of the coffees exactly the way he always did whenever we met before work. "Hazelnut latte," he said quietly. "Extra cinnamon." I accepted the cup almost automatically. "You remembered." He smiled, though it barely reached his eyes. "I always remember." That answer should have felt comforting, but tonight it only deepened the mystery. "Luke," I asked carefully, "what is going on?" Instead of answering, he looked toward the empty street stretching beyond the neighborhood before letting out a slow breath. "Do you trust me?" I laughed nervously. "You woke me up at 3 in the morning, and somehow my answer is still yes." His shoulders relaxed just enough for me to notice. "Good." He opened the passenger door of the truck. "Come with me." "Where?" "I will explain everything." I hesitated only long enough to realize I already knew I was going. Luke had been the person who showed up when my car broke down during a snowstorm, the person who waited with me through my father's surgery, the person who celebrated every photography exhibit as though my success belonged to both of us. If he was asking me to trust him now, there had to be a reason. I climbed into the passenger seat. The truck smelled faintly of fresh coffee and pine air freshener, exactly as it always had. As Luke pulled away from the curb, I noticed something resting on the dashboard between us. It was a sealed craft envelope with my full name written neatly across the front in his unmistakable handwriting. I looked from the envelope to him, but his eyes never left the empty road ahead. The city remained asleep around us while we drove beneath rows of silent streetlights. And without saying another word, Luke reached over and gently placed one hand on the envelope, as though protecting the most important decision he had ever carried. The truck rolled quietly through the sleeping streets of Denver, while every question in my mind grew heavier with each passing intersection. Luke kept both hands on the steering wheel, his attention fixed on the empty road ahead, but I noticed the way his fingers tightened every time we stopped at a red light. It was unlike him. Luke had always been the calm one. During college finals, when everyone else panicked, he calmly organized study sessions. When my apartment flooded 2 years earlier, he had shown up with towels, coffee, and a plan before I even knew where to begin. Watching him struggle to find words now felt strangely unsettling. I glanced toward the sealed envelope resting on the dashboard once again. My name was written across the front in neat block letters that looked unusually careful, almost as though he had rewritten them several times before settling on the final version. "How long have you had that?" I finally asked. Luke did not answer immediately. The truck continued moving beneath another row of quiet streetlights before he spoke. "Long enough." I waited for him to continue, but he simply shook his head slightly. "Not yet." His answer only deepened the mystery. Outside the windows, familiar neighborhoods slowly disappeared behind us as the streets became quieter and the buildings shorter. We crossed the South Platte River, past the old baseball stadium where we had watched countless summer games together, and continued toward the western edge of the city. Every landmark carried another memory. I remembered Luke buying me my first professional camera strap after my photography exhibit. I remembered waiting beside him in the hospital cafeteria after his first overnight shift as an emergency medical technician. Somehow, every important season of my adult life included him standing somewhere nearby. The realization settled quietly over me as the truck continued climbing toward the foothills. Luke reached for the radio but turned it off again before any music began playing. The silence seemed intentional rather than uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke. "Do you remember freshman year?" I smiled faintly. "The day we got locked out of the dorm because you forgot your key?" He laughed softly for the first time that night. "You never let me forget that. You climbed through a first-floor window instead of calling campus security. It worked. You also knocked over someone's laundry basket." His smile lingered for only a moment before fading again. "That was the night we became friends." I nodded. "You bought me breakfast the next morning because my meal card stopped working." You looked embarrassed. I was. Luke glanced toward me briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "You have always tried to handle everything alone." I looked down at the warm coffee still resting in my hands. "Maybe. You should not have to." Those 4 quiet words stayed with me longer than anything else he had said. Before I could respond, the truck slowed as we reached a scenic overlook above the city. Denver stretched below us beneath thousands of scattered lights, glowing against the darkness while the first faint hint of dawn remained hidden beyond the distant mountains. Luke parked near the wooden guardrail, but left the engine running. Neither of us moved right away. After several silent seconds, he checked the time on the dashboard clock. 3:48 in the morning. He closed his eyes briefly before whispering something so softly I almost missed it. "I have less than 45 minutes left." I turned toward him immediately. 45 minutes until what? Instead of answering, he carefully picked up the sealed envelope from the dashboard, held it in both hands for a long moment, and quietly said, "Everything depends on whether I can tell you the truth before the sun comes up." Luke continued holding the envelope without offering it to me. The city lights shimmered below the overlook, but neither of us seemed interested in the view anymore. Every bit of my attention remained fixed on the uncertainty in his face. I had known Luke Bennett for 8 years, long enough to recognize when something was weighing heavily on his mind. He always carried difficult things quietly. That was simply who he was. Tonight, however, the silence felt different. It did not feel like hesitation. It felt like someone standing at the edge of a decision that could never be taken back. "Luke," I said gently, "whatever this is, you do not have to carry it by yourself." He smiled faintly, though the sadness behind it remained. "That is the problem, Caleb. I have been carrying it by myself for far too long." He looked down at the envelope before carefully placing it back onto the dashboard instead of handing it to me. "I promised myself I would not let you read it unless I completely lost my nerve." I folded my arms against the cool mountain air. "Then tell me instead." He nodded slowly but started the truck once more. "Not here." We drove away from the overlook and continued climbing the winding mountain road. The city gradually disappeared behind us until only scattered lights remained visible through the trees. After another 15 minutes, Luke turned onto a narrow paved road leading toward a quiet public park overlooking the entire valley. I recognized it immediately. We had discovered this place during our sophomore year in college after getting hopelessly lost while searching for a hiking trail. Ever since then, whenever one of us needed to think, we somehow ended up here. The parking lot was empty except for Luke's truck. He turned off the engine, and for the first time that night the silence became complete. Even the wind seemed softer this high above the city. We stepped outside carrying our coffee and walked toward the wooden fence overlooking the valley. The first hint of dawn had not yet appeared, leaving the mountains wrapped in deep shades of blue and gray. Luke rested both hands on the railing while I stood beside him, waiting. Finally he spoke. "Do you remember the promise we made here?" I searched my memory before smiling. "We promised that no matter where our careers took us, we would never disappear from each other's lives." Luke nodded. "I have thought about that promise almost every day." His voice remained calm, but I could hear something fragile beneath every word. Then why does tonight feel like goodbye? I asked quietly. He closed his eyes for a brief moment before reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. Instead of removing the envelope this time, he unfolded a single printed document. Even in the dim light, I could make out an official company logo across the top. He handed it to me without speaking. I read only the first few lines before looking back at him. It was an employment offer from a medical air rescue program based in Seattle. The position included advanced emergency response training and a long-term contract. The final page clearly stated that his acceptance had to be submitted before 4:30 that morning. I lowered the document slowly. You got the job. Luke nodded once. 3 weeks ago. The word struck harder than I expected. 3 weeks. He looked toward the sleeping city below instead of meeting my eyes. I wanted to tell you. Every single day I planned to. Every single day I convinced myself tomorrow would be easier. I tightened my grip on the papers, struggling to understand why my chest suddenly felt so heavy. So why call me now? Luke finally looked directly at me, and the honesty in his expression stopped every other question before it could leave my mouth. Because I realized I could leave this city without my apartment, without my furniture, even without most of my memories, he said softly. But I could not imagine leaving without seeing you one last time, and that terrified me far more than moving away ever did. The cold mountain air settled around us as the words echoed in my mind. I could not imagine leaving without seeing you one last time. I stared at Luke, searching for some sign that this was only exhaustion talking after too many overnight shifts, but everything about his expression told me he had rehearsed this conversation countless times before finally gathering the courage to make that phone call. I looked down at the offer letter once more before folding it carefully and handing it back to him. You should have told me 3 weeks ago, I said quietly. He accepted the papers without arguing. I know. Do you have any idea how many times we saw each other during those 3 weeks? He gave a small nod. Almost every day. We had dinner together last Friday. I remember. You helped me carry new shelves into my apartment. I remember that too. My voice remained calm, but disappointment settled into every word. You sat across from me, smiled, joked about my terrible cooking, and somehow never mentioned that you might be moving halfway across the country. Luke lowered his eyes toward the wooden railing. I tried. Every time I saw you. He let out a slow breath. Then I convinced myself it was the wrong moment. The honesty in his answer made it impossible to stay angry, yet it did not erase the hurt. You decided all of this alone. No, he replied softly. I delayed deciding because of you. That answer caught me completely off guard. Before I could ask what he meant, Luke walked a few steps toward the overlook and rested both hands on the railing again. The city lights below shimmered quietly while the eastern horizon began showing the faintest hint of gray. Dawn was approaching faster than either of us wanted. The training program starts next month, he said. It is everything I have worked toward for years. Better equipment, more responsibility, opportunities that almost never become available. I nodded. Then why do you sound like accepting it feels wrong? He smiled without happiness. Because every time I imagined packing my apartment, there was one thing I could never figure out. I waited. How to leave you behind. The sentence landed with unexpected weight. I looked away toward the sleeping city, suddenly remembering dozens of moments that had never seemed unusual before. Luke bringing coffee to my studio before important photography exhibits. Waiting outside in freezing weather after my late editing sessions because he did not want me walking home alone. Remembering every birthday, every small victory, every disappointment before I even mentioned it. I had always called those things friendship because I never stopped to question whether they might mean something more. Why tonight? I finally asked. Why not tomorrow? Luke checked the time on his watch. 4 o'clock. Because the company needs my answer by 4:30. He reached toward the dashboard through the open truck door and picked up the sealed envelope again. His thumb rested gently across my name written on the front. If I choose Seattle, I leave in 3 weeks. He paused before continuing. If I stay, everything changes. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. What is inside? He held it close to his chest for a long moment before answering with quiet certainty. The real reason I have not been able to say yes, and the reason I have been terrified to tell you no matter how many times I practiced the conversation. As the first pale streaks of dawn slowly appeared above the mountains, I realized the job offer was no longer the biggest mystery standing between us. Whatever truth Luke had hidden inside that envelope had been shaping every decision he made long before this unforgettable night began. Luke remained silent for several long seconds, holding the envelope as though letting go of it would change the course of everything that followed. The first traces of dawn slowly brightened the eastern horizon, painting the mountains in pale shades of blue and silver. I checked the time on my phone without thinking. 4:07 in the morning. 23 minutes remained before the deadline printed across the employment offer. The ticking clock suddenly felt louder than the quiet wind surrounding us. "Luke," I said gently, "if this opportunity means everything to your career, I do not want to be the reason you give it up." He looked at me with a tired smile. "That is exactly why I could never make this decision alone." He stepped away from the overlook and leaned lightly against the truck, staring down at the unopened envelope in his hands. "Everyone keeps congratulating me," he continued. "My supervisor said I would be crazy to turn it down. My parents told me opportunities like this only happen once. My coworkers have been asking when I start packing." He laughed quietly, though there was little joy behind the sound. "Every person I talked to assumed I had already made my choice." "Except you had not," I answered. He shook his head. "Not really." The silence returned, but this time it carried understanding rather than uncertainty. I suddenly remembered a conversation from nearly 2 years earlier after one of my photography exhibits. We had been loading framed prints into my car when I casually mentioned receiving an offer to relocate to Portland for a magazine position. Luke had smiled, congratulated me, and helped me carry every box without saying a single negative word. A week later, I declined the offer because something about leaving Denver had never felt right. At the time, I blamed family, familiar streets, and loyal clients. Standing beside Luke now, I wondered if I had been protecting something I never fully understood. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He nodded. "When did you decide to apply for Seattle?" Luke exhaled slowly. "Almost a year ago." I stared at him in surprise. "A year?" I submitted the application after convincing myself that putting 1,000 miles between us would make life simpler. His words settled heavily between us. "Simpler?" I repeated. "For who?" He looked toward the city lights one last time before answering. "For me." I thought distance might help me stop hoping for something that probably was never going to happen. My heartbeat quickened, though I still did not fully understand what he meant. Before I could respond, he carefully placed the envelope into my hands for the first time that night. It felt surprisingly light. The paper was worn around the edges, as though it had been carried everywhere for months. I looked down at my name written across the front and noticed a date beneath it. 11 months earlier. "You wrote this then?" I asked softly. Luke nodded. "The night I submitted my application." "Why did you never give it to me?" He smiled with quiet honesty. "Because every time I saw you, I decided having you as my best friend mattered more than risking everything for words I could never take back." I traced my thumb lightly across the sealed flap, but did not open it. Somehow it no longer felt like an ordinary letter. It felt like nearly a year of unanswered conversations folded into a few sheets of paper. Luke glanced at the clock inside the truck. 4:13. He closed his eyes briefly before speaking again. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes, there is one thing I cannot leave unsaid anymore." The calm certainty in his voice made me realize that the envelope had never been the real confession. It was only the courage he needed until he could finally speak the truth aloud. Luke looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time since the phone rang that morning, he stopped searching for safer words. The quiet confidence that had always made him dependable was still there, but now it carried something more vulnerable. He folded his arms against the cool breeze and smiled, almost apologetically. "The job was never the real problem," he said. "The problem was believing I could spend the rest of my life pretending that what I felt for you was only friendship." My breath caught before I even realized I had stopped breathing. The mountain overlook remained perfectly still around us, while the first soft light of dawn slowly spread across the horizon. I searched his face for any sign that he regretted saying the words aloud, but instead I saw relief. It was the expression of someone who had finally put down a weight he had carried alone for far too long. "I kept telling myself it would pass," Luke continued quietly. "I thought if enough time went by, I would stop noticing the small things. I thought I would stop remembering how you always ordered the same coffee, how you smiled every time you finished editing a photograph you loved, how you called me whenever something good happened, because I was the first person you wanted to tell. I waited for those feelings to become ordinary memories, but they only became stronger. I lowered my eyes to the unopened envelope resting in my hands. Suddenly, everything that had seemed confusing over the past year began fitting together with surprising clarity. Every invitation he never declined. Every late-night drive after difficult workdays. Every birthday he somehow made unforgettable. Every quiet moment when he had looked at me as though he wanted to say something but chose silence instead. I had accepted every act of kindness without ever asking myself why it always came from the same person. Seattle was supposed to fix that, Luke admitted. I convinced myself that if I moved far enough away, I would finally learn how to let those feelings become part of my past. I thought distance would protect both of us. I looked back at him. Protect us from what? He answered without hesitation. From losing the friendship that means more to me than anything else. Those words settled gently between us. There was no pressure hidden inside them, no expectation, only honesty. That honesty made everything feel even more important. I slowly turned the envelope over in my hands. The seal remained untouched. Is this a confession? I asked. Luke gave a small nod. It started that way. He smiled softly. Then I rewrote it several times until it became something else. What did it become? A goodbye I hoped you would never have to read. I looked at the date written beneath my name once more and realized he had been carrying that letter for almost an entire year. Through birthdays, road trips, holiday dinners, ordinary weekends, and countless conversations, he had chosen my comfort over his own uncertainty every single time. The realization filled me with emotions I could not immediately name. The eastern sky continued growing brighter, and the city below slowly awakened beneath the morning light. Somewhere in the distance, the first rays of sunlight touched the tallest buildings. Luke glanced briefly at his watch before slipping his phone from his jacket pocket. The screen illuminated his face. 4:21 in the morning. 9 minutes remained before he had to respond to the offer waiting in his email. He looked at the phone for only a second before locking the screen again, without opening the message. Then he turned back toward me with calm sincerity. I am not asking you to answer my feelings today, he said. I only wanted you to know the truth before I made a decision that might have taken me out of your life forever. Whatever happens after this moment, at least you will know why leaving suddenly became the hardest thing I have ever considered doing. Luke's words remained suspended in the cool morning air long after he finished speaking. He was not asking me for an answer. He was not asking me to change my life overnight. He had only given me the truth he had hidden for nearly a year, and somehow that simple honesty left me speechless. I looked down at the unopened envelope again, then back toward the waking city below us. The first golden light of sunrise spread across the rooftops, and with it came memories I had never bothered to examine before. I remembered the winter morning when my car refused to start before an important photography assignment. Luke had arrived 20 minutes later with jumper cables, breakfast sandwiches, and a joke that made me laugh. Before the engine even turned over, I remembered the summer afternoon when one of my gallery exhibits sold every framed photograph. Before I called my parents or any other friend, I had called Luke. I remembered the countless evenings when he would text a single sentence asking whether I had made it home safely after driving through the mountains alone. None of those moments had seemed unusual because they had become part of the rhythm of my everyday life. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking why the person standing beside me always happened to be Luke. My thoughts drifted further back to college. Freshman year. The broken meal card. The long conversations that somehow lasted until sunrise. The weekend road trips with no destination except finding somewhere quiet enough to talk about everything we were afraid to admit to anyone else. Even after graduation, when our careers pulled us in different directions, we somehow protected time for each other without ever discussing it. Every Saturday breakfast. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every difficult season. It was as though we had quietly built a life around one another without realizing it. I slowly lifted my eyes toward Luke again. He had not moved. He stood patiently beside the truck, giving me all the space I needed while expecting nothing in return. That familiar kindness suddenly felt different. It no longer looked like simple friendship. It looked like years of quiet devotion that had never demanded recognition. Can I tell you something? I asked softly. He nodded. I always believed you were the most dependable person I had ever met. A faint smile appeared on his face. I have always tried to be. I shook my head gently. No, It was more than that. I laughed quietly at myself as another realization surfaced. Every time something happened in my life, good or bad, I automatically looked for you. If I found an incredible place to photograph, I wanted to show you first. If work became overwhelming, you were the person I called. When my apartment finally started feeling like home, it was because you helped me build half the furniture inside it. Luke remained silent, allowing me to continue. I never questioned any of it because it felt completely natural. I looked toward the envelope resting between my hands. Now I am starting to wonder whether I confused something familiar with something ordinary. Luke's expression softened, but he still did not interrupt. The silence between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt patient, understanding, safe. His phone vibrated inside his jacket, breaking the quiet. Neither of us reached for it immediately. After several seconds, Luke finally looked at the screen. 4:26 in the morning. A reminder notification appeared across the display, informing him that only a few minutes remained before his response deadline expired. He slowly locked the phone again without opening the email, then looked back at me with calm acceptance. "Whatever you decide to say next," he whispered, "I promise it will never erase everything we have already shared." As I looked into his eyes, I realized the greatest surprise of the night was not discovering that Luke loved me. It was discovering how impossible it suddenly felt to imagine a future where he was no longer standing beside me. The quiet certainty in Luke's voice settled somewhere deep inside me, leaving behind a feeling I had never expected to experience. For years I had believed the strongest part of our friendship was how comfortable everything felt. We never forced conversations. We never competed with one another. We simply existed in each other's lives with the kind of trust that most people spent decades searching for. Standing beside him as the sunrise slowly painted the mountains gold, I suddenly realized that comfort had never happened by accident. It had been built through thousands of quiet choices, almost all of them made by both of us without saying a word. I looked down at the envelope again before carefully breaking the seal. Luke watched silently, but made no attempt to stop me. Inside rested several neatly folded pages. The handwriting was unmistakably his, steady and careful from the very first line. I began reading quietly to myself. The letter did not begin with a dramatic confession. Instead, it listed ordinary moments. The morning we met because I forgot my wallet in the campus cafeteria. The first road trip where we became hopelessly lost and laughed harder than either of us had in years. The evening we sat on the hood of his truck watching a meteor shower without speaking for almost an hour because silence somehow felt complete. Each memory was followed by one simple sentence explaining why he had never forgotten it. As I continued reading, I realized the letter was not trying to persuade me to feel anything. It simply documented the life we had already shared through his eyes. Near the final page, the tone changed. He had written that if I was reading those words, it meant he had failed to find the courage to tell me everything face to face. He explained that accepting the position in Seattle had seemed easier than risking the possibility of losing the person who had become his safest place. Then came the final paragraph. It was only a few sentences long. He wrote that if friendship was all I could ever offer, he would remain grateful for every year we had shared. He would leave with wonderful memories instead of regret, because knowing me had already changed his life for the better. He ended by writing that real care never demanded an answer. It simply hoped the other person found happiness, even if that happiness followed a different path. I lowered the pages slowly. My vision had blurred slightly, not because of sadness, but because every memory inside the letter matched one I carried myself. I looked at Luke, who stood quietly with his hands inside his jacket pockets, giving me space exactly as he always had. "You remembered all of that," I whispered. He smiled gently. "Every single one." I laughed softly through an unsteady breath. I thought I was the one carrying a camera everywhere because I never wanted to forget anything. "You captured photographs," he replied. "I collected moments." Those words settled into my heart with unexpected clarity. I stepped closer until only a short distance remained between us. "Luke," I said carefully, "I think I spent so many years believing our friendship was permanent that I never stopped to ask myself why losing it suddenly feels impossible." He looked at me without speaking. The morning sunlight illuminated his face, replacing the shadows that had followed him throughout the night. His phone vibrated once more inside his pocket. 4:29 in the morning. 1 minute remained before the deadline. He slowly reached for the device, glanced at the screen, and quietly said, "Before I answer them, there is only one thing I still need to know." His voice remained calm, but the hope in his eyes was impossible to miss as he waited for the words only I could give. Luke looked at the phone in his hand, but did not touch the screen. The countdown that had controlled the entire night no longer seemed as important as the silence between us. I took another slow step forward until we stood close enough to hear each other's breathing over the gentle mountain breeze. The letter remained folded in my hands, but I already knew the words inside were no longer the most important part of this moment. The person who had written them was standing in front of me, waiting with remarkable patience for an answer he had never tried to demand. I smiled softly, still amazed by how many things suddenly made sense. "Do you remember the weekend my photography exhibit almost failed because the delivery truck broke down?" I asked. Luke looked surprised by the question, but nodded. "Of course I remember. You drove across the city 3 times helping me carry framed prints into the gallery." He laughed quietly. "That was not a big deal." I shook my head. "That is exactly what I mean. You never believed any of those moments were a big deal. You simply showed up." I paused, searching for the words I should have understood years earlier. "You were there after every disappointment. You celebrated every success before I even had time to celebrate it myself. Somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about whether you would be beside me because I assumed you always would." Luke listened without interrupting. His expression carried hope, but also careful restraint, as though he refused to let himself expect too much. I took one more breath. "When you said you might leave, I thought I was afraid of losing my best friend." I smiled faintly. Now I realized that was only part of the truth. His eyes never left mine. "The harder truth is that I cannot imagine building the rest of my life without the person who has quietly become the center of it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The morning sunlight spread across the overlook, warming the wooden railing and the hood of the truck. The city below had fully awakened, yet our small corner of the mountains still felt untouched by the noise of the day. Luke finally lowered his gaze with a quiet laugh of disbelief before looking back at me. "Caleb," he whispered, "are you saying what I think you are saying?" I nodded slowly. I do not know exactly when friendship became something deeper. Maybe it happened one ordinary day after another. Maybe it happened so gradually that I never noticed until tonight. But I know this. The thought of you driving away forever hurts far more than the thought of admitting how much you mean to me. Relief softened every feature of his face. He slipped his phone back into his pocket without opening the message waiting on the screen. "The deadline," I reminded him gently. Luke smiled, calmer than he had been all night. "There will be another conversation with the program director." I looked at him with curiosity. "You are not accepting it?" He shook his head. "I am not rejecting my future either. I am simply refusing to decide my future while believing I have to face it alone." Those words felt exactly right. I reached out and lightly rested my hand against his forearm. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried years of unspoken trust. Luke covered my hand with his own, and for the first time that morning neither of us felt the need to hide behind uncertainty. The sunrise continued climbing above the mountains as we stood together, no longer wondering whether the night had changed everything. We already knew it had. What began with one unexpected phone call had ended with 2 lifelong friends finally choosing to face every tomorrow side by side. Not because either of us feared being alone, but because we had finally recognized that home had never been a place on a map. Home had quietly become the person waiting beside us all along. The drive back toward the city felt completely different from the drive that had brought us into the mountains. Nothing about the road had changed. The same winding curves, the same pine trees, and the same quiet morning sky surrounded us. Yet everything inside the truck felt lighter. Luke drove with one hand resting comfortably on the steering wheel, while the folded letter remained safely tucked inside my backpack, instead of hidden inside an unopened envelope. Every now and then our eyes met for only a second before we smiled without needing to explain why. It was the kind of silence that only appeared after the truth had finally been welcomed instead of feared. As the first commuters began filling the highways below, Luke glanced toward me and laughed softly. "I have been imagining this conversation for almost a year," he admitted. "None of the versions in my head ended like this." I smiled. "How did they end?" He shrugged with quiet honesty. "Usually you thank me for being honest, wish me luck in Seattle, and we promised to stay friends no matter how far apart we lived. I looked out the passenger window at the familiar skyline, growing larger ahead of us. That sounds like something I probably would have said if you had left without giving me the chance to understand what you were really feeling. Luke nodded slowly. I know. We stopped at a red light near the neighborhood where we had spent countless Saturday mornings eating breakfast together. The small family diner had just turned on its open sign. Luke pointed toward it with a grin. We have not eaten since yesterday afternoon. My stomach immediately reminded me that he was right. I laughed. You were still thinking about breakfast after everything that happened? Especially after everything that happened, he answered. Life keeps moving. I do not want the ordinary moments to disappear just because we finally admitted something extraordinary. That simple sentence stayed with me as we parked outside the diner a few minutes later. Inside, everything looked exactly the same as it always had. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. The waitress greeted us by name before leading us to our usual booth beside the front window. She placed 2 menus on the table, then smiled knowingly. You two are earlier than usual today. Luke glanced toward me before answering with a relaxed smile. It has been a memorable morning. She laughed politely without asking further questions and walked away to prepare coffee. I watched Luke across the table, noticing details I had somehow overlooked for years. The way he wrapped both hands around a warm coffee mug before taking the first sip. The small crease that appeared near his eyes whenever he smiled sincerely. The calm patience that seemed to follow him everywhere. None of those things were new. The only thing that had changed was my willingness to see them differently. What happens now? I asked. Luke rested his elbows lightly on the table. First, I called the program director and explained that I need more time before making a final decision. I nodded. And after that, he looked at me with quiet confidence. After that, we make decisions together instead of protecting each other with silence. I smiled because that answer somehow felt stronger than any promise either of us could have made. We were not pretending difficult choices would disappear. Seattle still existed. Careers still mattered. Real life would continue asking complicated questions. The difference was that neither of us intended to answer those questions alone anymore. As sunlight poured through the diner windows, illuminating the steam rising from our coffee cups, I realized the night had not given us an ending. It had given us something far more meaningful. For the first time since we met as uncertain college freshmen, we were beginning the next chapter of our lives with complete honesty, knowing that whatever direction the road eventually took, we had finally chosen to walk it side by side. After breakfast, we stepped outside into the bright Colorado morning with paper coffee cups in our hands. And for the first time in years, there was nothing left hidden between us. The city looked exactly as it always had. Cars moved through busy intersections, people hurried toward work, and the familiar sounds of ordinary life filled the streets. Yet everything felt different, because I no longer wondered whether Luke was quietly carrying something he could never say. We walked slowly toward my apartment instead of driving away immediately. Neither of us seemed eager to end the conversation that had begun before sunrise. I should call the program director, Luke said, glancing at his phone. I promised I would respond this morning. I nodded. You should. He looked at me carefully. Would you mind waiting? I smiled. I have waited 8 years without knowing what we were really talking about. I think I can wait a few more minutes. Luke laughed softly before stepping a short distance away to make the call. I watched him from the sidewalk while sunlight reflected across the nearby windows. His voice remained calm and respectful as he explained that he was deeply grateful for the opportunity, but needed additional time before making a final commitment. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. When he returned, relief had replaced the uncertainty that had followed him throughout the night. They gave me another week, he said with a surprised smile. Apparently, they value honesty more than rushed decisions. That sounds like a good place to work, I replied. I think so too. We continued walking until we reached the small neighborhood park where we had spent countless afternoons after college, eating sandwiches on a weathered wooden bench whenever both of us happened to have the same day off. Without discussing it, we sat in the exact same place. Children laughed on a distant playground while a golden retriever chased a tennis ball across the grass. Life continued around us with gentle simplicity, reminding me that extraordinary moments often settled quietly into ordinary mornings. Can I ask you something? Luke said. Anything. He rested his coffee beside him before speaking. Last night, before I called you, I almost drove away without saying anything. If I had done that, what do you think would have happened? I considered the question carefully. I think we would have kept texting each other. We would have congratulated one another on birthdays. We would have pretended everything was normal. I paused before continuing. But I also think there would always have been something unfinished between us, even if neither of us admitted it. Luke slowly nodded. That is exactly what I was afraid of. I reached into my backpack and removed the letter he had written nearly a year earlier. The paper had already become one of the most meaningful things I owned. I am keeping this, I told him. Not because it reminds me of what almost happened, but because it reminds me what honesty can change. He smiled warmly. I was hoping you would say that. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to my bag. There is something else I realized this morning, I admitted. Love did not suddenly appear on that mountain. It had been quietly growing every time we chose each other without making a big announcement about it. I simply needed one unforgettable night to recognize what had already become true. Luke looked toward the trees moving gently in the breeze before meeting my eyes again. Then maybe the most important part of this story is not that everything changed overnight. I tilted my head with curiosity. He smiled with quiet confidence. Maybe the truth is that everything had been changing for years, and we finally found the courage to notice it together. 1 week passed more quickly than either of us expected. Instead of avoiding the difficult conversation waiting ahead, we spent those days doing something neither of us had done before. We allowed honesty to become part of our ordinary routine. Luke stopped hiding the uncertainty surrounding the Seattle opportunity, and I stopped pretending that my own future had nothing to do with his. We talked openly while walking through neighborhood parks, sharing quiet dinners, and driving through the same familiar streets that had witnessed so many years of friendship. The conversations were never dramatic. They were thoughtful, patient, and filled with the kind of respect that had always defined our relationship. One evening, we spread maps across my dining table, comparing the possibilities together. Seattle offered extraordinary professional growth for Luke. Denver remained the place where both of us had built careers, friendships, and memories that stretched back almost a decade. Rather than asking whether one choice was right and the other wrong, we asked a different question. How could we make a decision that respected both dreams instead of forcing one person to sacrifice everything? That single change in perspective transformed the entire discussion. Luke admitted that for months he had believed love meant quietly giving up his own future if it protected someone else from discomfort. I confessed that I had spent years assuming independence meant solving every challenge alone. Together we realized neither belief had truly served us. Healthy relationships were not built on silent sacrifice. They were built on honest conversations, shared decisions, and the willingness to face uncertainty together. A few days later, Luke received another call from the Medical Air Rescue Program. They remained interested in offering him the position and even explained that part of the advanced training could begin several months later if necessary. The unexpected flexibility surprised both of us. When Luke ended the call, he looked at me with the same calm smile I had trusted since college. It turns out asking for time was not a mistake, he said. Sometimes people understand more than we expect. I smiled because the sentence described far more than his career. That weekend we returned to the mountain overlook where everything had changed. Unlike our previous visit, the parking area was filled with hikers preparing for sunrise. Families carried cameras. Children laughed while chasing one another across the grass, and warm light slowly spread across the distant peaks. We stood beside the same wooden railing where Luke had finally spoken the truth. This time there was no envelope between us, no hidden confession, and no countdown waiting on a phone screen. Only quiet gratitude remained. I used to think courage meant saying the perfect words, Luke said while looking across the valley. Now I think courage is simply trusting someone enough to tell them the truth before fear makes the decision for you. I nodded slowly because I finally understood exactly what he meant. If he had driven away that night without making the call, our lives might have continued, but they would have been built around an unfinished conversation. Instead, one difficult choice created room for a future that neither of us could have imagined alone. As the morning sun climbed higher above the mountains, I realized the most meaningful journeys were rarely measured by miles traveled. They were measured by the distance between silence and honesty, and together we had finally crossed it. Several months later, life looked wonderfully familiar while feeling completely new. Luke and I still met for breakfast at the same neighborhood diner almost every Saturday morning. I still spent long afternoons inside my photography studio editing landscape photographs, and he still worked demanding shifts helping people through difficult moments with the same quiet compassion that had first inspired me years earlier. Some things had changed, though. We no longer assumed the other person knew what we were thinking. We said it. We celebrated ordinary victories together, talked honestly about difficult choices, and learned that the strongest relationships were not built on perfect timing, but on consistent trust. After many thoughtful conversations, Luke accepted a revised training schedule with the Seattle Medical Air Rescue Program that allowed him to complete advanced certification through a flexible combination of travel and scheduled sessions before making any permanent relocation decision. Instead of viewing distance as something that would separate us, we treated every challenge as another problem we could solve together. That single change transformed everything. On a cool autumn afternoon, almost 6 months after the unforgettable phone call, we returned once again to the mountain overlook where the sun had first risen on a completely different future. The trees surrounding the valley had turned brilliant shades of gold, amber, and crimson. Families stopped to admire the scenery while photographers carefully adjusted tripods along the wooden fence. I carried my favorite camera over one shoulder, and Luke carried 2 familiar cups of hazelnut coffee with extra cinnamon. He smiled as he handed one to me. Some traditions should never change, he said. I laughed softly. I was about to say exactly the same thing. We stood side by side looking across the valley in comfortable silence. This time there were no unanswered questions waiting between us, only gratitude for the courage that had brought us back to this place. I reached into my camera bag and carefully removed the folded letter that Luke had once believed I would only read after he disappeared from my life. The edges had become slightly worn from being carried so often, but every word inside remained just as meaningful. Do you know why I keep this with me? I asked. Luke looked at the envelope thoughtfully. Because it reminds you of that morning? I smiled and shook my head. Because it reminds me that one honest conversation can completely change the direction of a life. I folded the letter once more and placed it safely back inside my bag. Luke gently rested his hand over mine for a brief moment, and I realized the gesture felt as natural as every quiet act of kindness that had slowly built our relationship over the years. Looking across the mountains, I thought about how close we had come to living 2 separate futures shaped by fear instead of truth. If one phone call had never been made, we might have spent years wondering what could have happened. Instead, we discovered that the greatest turning points rarely arrive with perfect certainty. Sometimes they begin with a ringing phone in the middle of the night, a familiar voice asking someone to come outside, and the willingness to listen before the moment slips away forever. As the late afternoon sunlight settled gently across the valley, I lifted my camera and captured one final photograph of the place where everything had quietly changed. When I lowered it again, Luke was already smiling at me exactly the way he had on the morning we finally stopped hiding from our own hearts. In that peaceful moment, I understood something I would carry for the rest of my life. Home is not defined by the city where you live, the career you choose, or the miles you travel. Home is the person who gives you the courage to become your most honest self, and sometimes the most important journey begins the instant you decide to answer a single unexpected phone call.